Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, The Power of Listening. It's hosted by us, the ASU Humanities Institute. My name is Curtis Austin, and I am the acting director of the Institute. I'm thrilled to see you all here and online as we explore a topic that is both timeless and increasingly relevant in today's fast-paced and often divisive world. And that topic, of course, is listening. Here at the Humanities Institute, our mission is to create spaces for meaningful dialogue and intellectual exploration. We believe the humanities offer invaluable tools for understanding complex social, cultural, and ethical issues. And events like today's panel serve as an important reminder that listening, true active listening, is a fundamental part of how we connect as human beings, how we bridge divides, and how we foster empathy. The power of listening is not just about the act of hearing words, but about fully engaging with others, understanding perspectives, and responding thoughtfully. Whether in personal relationships, social movements, or even in academic discourse, which we have a lot of here, listening can be a powerful force for change, collaboration, and growth. Today's esteemed panelists come from our very own Department of English, and they will share their insights on how listening shapes their work and impacts the broader community. Krista Ratcliff is a foundation professor at ASU whose research focuses on intersections of rhetoric, feminist theory, and critical race studies. She is the author of multiple books on gender, race, intersectionalities, and rhetorics. Professor Jensen is the director of writing programs at ASU. His research explores modern rhetorical theory, rhetorical education, and most recently, AI literacy. He is the author of several books on writing studies and theories of rhetoric. So I encourage you to reflect on the role of listening in your own life and to participate actively in this conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you leave today feeling inspired by the power of listening. Please enjoy the event.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks for being online. As Curtis said, Kyle and I have been invited here today to talk about the power of listening. Today, we're going to report on our ongoing research. It's a book tentatively titled Listening Across Divides, From the Dinner Table to the Workplace. I'm going to briefly define the terms of the study, and then Kyle is going to talk about our survey, which asks people to self-assess how they listen. Then we'll hopefully have a lot of time for questions from people here and online. So let me begin by defining listening. As a rhetoric and composition scholar, I began studying listening about 30 years ago. Why? Well, from its beginnings, rhetoric has focused on 4 rhetorical arts: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. For classical Greek and Roman rhetorical theorists, Isocrates and Aristotle, Cicero and Quintilian, these 4 arts are integrated, and they dominated Western rhetorical education from 5th century BCE through the 19th century, when American universities adopted a German model and organized themselves into discipline-based departments, with rhetoric located in English departments. Now, in the early 20th century, 1914 to be exact, the study of rhetoric fractured. Speech scholars withdrew from English departments and started their own discipline and departments. Reading and writing stayed in English, and speaking and listening went to speech, now communication. By the 1990s, when I was beginning my career, I started asking what would happen if rhetoric and composition scholars started within English departments, tried to reintegrate listening into rhetoric and composition studies, into our own thinking and teaching. So in a 1998 article and a 2006 book, I posit and define a concept called rhetorical listening. And I talk about 3 tactics for enacting it. Then, in response to people's continued interest in how rhetorical listening might be used, Kyle and I co-authored a 2022 book that offers additional tactics, how rhetorical listening may be practiced in the classroom and beyond. Initially, I defined rhetorical listening as a trope for interpretive convention and as a code of cross-cultural conduct, which enables people to listen across divides. In this way, listening signifies not merely a physical capacity of hearing, rather, it signifies an open way of positioning oneself in relation to people, texts, and cultures. It focuses not just on what is written or said, but also on what is assumed, and, importantly, what is rendered excess. It is predicated on a person's capacity and willingness to listen. By focusing on more than just what is said or written, listeners have the potential to identify more possible places of common ground. Thus, the purpose of rhetorical listening is to help listeners hear discourses and silences surrounding any problem. Although there are many different tactics that one may use to listen rhetorically, the general practice includes the following moves. 1, assume an open stance. 2, lay competing claims and cultural logics side by side. Claims are simply assertions, right? Such as Trump rocks. Cultural logics are ways of thinking common to groups of people that affect how claims signify. So within a MAGA cultural logic, the claim, Trump rocks, is going to be heard as positive. But within a never-Trumper cultural logic, the assertion Trump rocks is going to be heard at best ironic and at worst dangerous, right? Same words, different interpretations. 3, pause to stand under the discourses of self and others in order to hear claims and cultural logics that may break through our usual ways of thinking. Analyze and reflect on what is heard in order to promote a deeper understanding of self and others, and then design, whenever possible, win-win solutions. Now, these are conceptualized not as victories. A lot of rhetorical history has battles as the dominant metaphor. I'm not into that. I'm not talking about victories. I'm talking about situations where participants feel as if their interests have been heard, considered, and, if possible, integrated into decision-making. As the previous slide made visible, rhetorical listening is a structure or form of thinking that may be applied to any topic and employed from any cultural position. Though in my book, I exemplified rhetorical listening by focusing on gender and whiteness, I'm not limiting listening to only those topics. Excuse me. Rather, I had hoped to model that listening may be done from both insider and outsider positions. That is, from positions that have been historically privileged, like my whiteness, but also from positions that have been historically not so privileged, such as my gender. That said, just because rhetorical listening may be practiced within multiple topics from multiple positions doesn't mean that it always should be. Like any other rhetorical concept or tactic, it's situational. Rhetorical listening may be appropriate and useful for some situations, but not others. It's up to the potential listener to decide. Defined as a means to understanding, rhetorical listening is intended to help listeners figure out how people who think differently from us operate. But understanding is not an end in itself. It is a means to intentional actions. Listening to understand how a cultural logic such as patriarchy or white supremacy or fascism works does not mean listeners sanction these cultural logics. Rather, such listening makes visible, especially for students, I think, how these and other cultural logics often function as unstated assumptions that haunt our daily lives, whether in curricula, politics, workplaces, or social settings. One question that has haunted rhetorical listening is, what happens if someone is not willing to listen? Well, my standard answer, as mentioned earlier, is listening doesn't work in every situation. That's true of any concept or tactic in rhetoric. But this response, while true, leaves unstated and unexamined another important question, which can be framed a little more positively. What makes a person, a group of people, or an institution willing to listen? Our current research project tries to answer the latter question by identifying and defining 10 capacities of listening. These 10 capacities include presence, attending to the moment; curiosity, a need to know, generated either by personal interest or dictated by outside forces; suspension, a pausing to hold two or more competing ideas simultaneously in mind without judging; association, analyzing across multiple contexts and systems; focus, analyzing deeply within one context or one system; generosity, choosing to grant charitable, not just highly critical interpretations of any problem; accountability, recognizing that while listeners may not be responsible for a problem's origin, they may have an ethical imperative to act; perseverance, a stick-to-itness needed to initiate both short-term and long-term change; gratitude, choosing to be thankful for the moment of listening, thankful for knowing what we know and thankful for being able to address a problem; and finally, willingness, a readiness not just to listen, but to act. Interestingly, these 10 capacities may function in various ways: as a sequence from presence to willingness; more interestingly, as ratios, connections between, what were you saying, perseverance and presence. And individually, someone may be primarily a generous listener. In sum, we believe that everyone possesses these 10 capacities, to different degrees, of course. We also believe that to become better listeners, people need to assess how well they perform these capacities of listening. To that end, we've developed a survey to help people self-assess and then practice how to become better listeners. On that note, I'll turn it over to Kyle, who will talk about our survey and its preliminary results.
I'll walk around this way.
I'll get out of your way.
No, that's good. We got it this way. Hi. Thank you for being here. So, one of the challenges that Chris and I encountered when we were trying to build out a more robust theory of listening is, how do we actually measure the way that individual listeners process the world around them? As rhetoricians, we know, for example, that the way that we listen can be highly contextualized depending on whoever is in the room. And yet, our kind of intuitive knowledge about how people communicate tells us that we have habituated patterns of listening. One of our colleagues that we work with on this listening assessment, we were working on the data processing for it, and we were trying to understand a specific kind of capacity. And he paused and he looked up at me and he said to me, he goes, "I don't know if you know this, but you are the living embodiment of focused listening." And I started to laugh because I think actually it's a very keen observation. He's like that. But what it punctuated is that even if I'm leaning into these kinds of focused capacities, doesn't mean I lack the others, but I lean into them because for whatever reason, situationally, it benefits me to do so. So what I want to do is talk a little bit today about our listening assessment, how we actually measure the way that people listen, what are some of our assumptions, and then I'm going to share with you some of our preliminary data. And it's pretty fun stuff, so hopefully you'll be excited by it. Okay, so what is a listening assessment? The first thing that we do is we present a series of statements that help us measure if and to what extent a listener employs a specific listening capacity. So for example, if we wanted to measure the listening capacity of presence, we might give you a statement such as, "I can read a room." Now when you read that statement, you'll have we're working with a 7-point Likert scale, so you'll have a number of different options of how much and to what degree you think that that's characteristic of your own stance on listening. For example, you might say, "I always can read a room." "I often am able to read a room." "I'm somewhat often." "Sometimes yes, sometimes no." "Somewhat infrequently," and then "never." Okay, so the important point to remember is that we don't tell you in the listening assessment which statement correlates to which listening capacity. But we, on the backside, know, based on how you answer the question, what it actually indicates. So when you answer using the 7-point Likert scale, we measure the listener's tendency towards certain listening capacities based on the strength of their response. And obviously, if you say, I can always read a room, or I can never read a room, that's probably going to be a higher indicator of one's own self-perception of oneself as a listener. Now, that doesn't always guarantee that you're listening along those lines, and I'll talk a little bit about how we try to triangulate that data. But what one believes oneself to be can often reinforce how one occupies a listening stance in any given situation. So if this is not the first time I've ever said, my friend told me that I'm the embodiment of a focused listener. I have identified myself as a focused listener, and I consciously perform that because I think maybe that's an area of strength in certain situations, and I'll get to that in a moment as well.
But not in others.
But not in others. It gets me in trouble in other situations, and I'll talk a little bit about that. One of the other things that we try to do is that not every question that we ask in our listening assessment cleaves the same way. And what we mean by that is, if you say, for example, I read a room, that statement might be indicative of multiple listening capacities simultaneously. As Chris said, one of the ways that we think about these listening capacities is that you can put them together as ratios, and one might tell you something about the other. Now, we productively split them, and we can talk a little bit about that during the Q&A, but if you say, I always read a room, that might correlate to other listening capacities, and we have the ability to triangulate that, and I'll show you how that plays out in just a moment. But for those questions that tell us quite a lot about a listener's disposition or a listener's preferred capacity in any given situation, we add weight to it because it tells us more. Okay. So what have we learned so far? We've had about 50 to 60 participants take our listening assessment. We have approximately 200 to 250 questions that we ask in any given moment. We've gone through multiple beta rounds to try and refine our questions to find out what questions work and which ones create, reasonable distribution on a quantitative scale. Here's what we've learned, and this is really important. No two listeners are the same. We've had 50 to 60 different people take our listening assessment, and no one person listens in exactly the same way. I'm tempted to say that the listening profile that we develop in response to this assessment is almost like a personal fingerprint. But the reason why I'm hesitant to do that is one does not want to make those kinds of proclamations with a smaller data set. But the data set suggests over and over again that the way that people process the world as listeners is incredibly nuanced and oftentimes surprising. I'll show you how that works in just a moment. Okay, the second lesson that we've learned that's incredibly important is that listeners tend to prefer 2 or 3 listening capacities over others. And that is true across each of our test subjects. So when we say, for example, we're gonna assess the data, and based on your answers, we're gonna tell you where you lean, it's not as if it's just one and there's everything else. Typically, it breaks into 2 or 3 preferred listening capacities, and then the distance between the two breaks pretty significant, or between the others breaks pretty significantly. So although listeners tend to prefer some listening capacities over others, every single test subject has shown the capacity for all 10 listening capacities. So it is not as if I'm the living embodiment of focused listening, it's not as if I don't listen with generosity, or I don't listen with willingness, or I don't listen with perseverance. But it might mean that my initial orientation toward any listening situation is with focus, and that can predominate to the degree that I underutilize the other listening capacities. But the important point here is that everybody has all 10 capacities, even though they might not use them equally well. This is a really important theoretical point because the ability to perform all 10 listening capacities shows that one may improve with focused training. So part of the reason why we're using this assessment, let's say someone at work and they find themselves listening in a particular way, and they're finding that they're engaged in conflict with their colleagues and they're not really sure why. They have a conversation with their colleagues and say, we really appreciate your focus, we like your attention to detail, but sometimes that attention, I'm not speaking specifically, I'll give you the other specific example. This is not an illusion. Sometimes your attention to detail can feel like micromanagement. And what we need you to do is listen with a little bit more generosity. We need you to give us the space to speak into the problem that we're trying to solve so that we feel like we have a role to play in the problem-solving process. The challenge in that situation is if one has become so accustomed to listening with focus that you say, well, that's not really what I do, and I've reasonably had so much success doing what I do, we're just at an impasse. But what our listening assessment shows is you do employ those, the focused listener would employ the capacity for generosity. It just is being eclipsed by an overcompensation in focus. And so if we can isolate that and say, actually, here are the ways you listen with generosity, and if you want to get better at some of these other behavioral characteristics of generosity, this is how you might do it. And so it implies that listening is not something innate that you either do or you don't do. It's something just like with argument and speaking and writing, you can train and get better at with practice over time. And the assessment helps us to target that in really specific ways. Okay, statements that we anticipated would produce compelling evidence, and I almost wrote the phrase, statements that we were certain would produce compelling evidence of a listener's preference for a listening capacity were ineffective. For example, we created the following statement thinking that it would absolutely be indicative of a curious listener. The places where I spend my time allow me to explore new or unfamiliar ideas. When we collected the data came back to us and said, this is a terrible indicator of curious listening. And the way that it's not a bad indication in the sense that it's just totally off the mark, it's that the statement that we're asking people to respond to is so, let's say, like self-evidently valuable to everyone that it actually doesn't differentiate from other kinds of listening capacities. And so one of the main challenges that we have faced in the process of developing this assessment is how do we measure if our statements actually specifically measure the behavioral functions that characterize a listening capacity. And the things that we thought would be really indicative of that oftentimes don't create enough qualitative differentiation that it actually allows us to pinpoint. Okay. And then, by contrast, statements that we anticipated would not return compelling evidence were surprisingly effective. So there were times when Chris and I were developing our statements, and we would say, we're not even sure this has a place in our assessment, but it seems tangentially related. We might as well, we're running a beta test anyway, let's see if it works. And it turns out that it actually creates incredibly rich insight into how a person listens. More often than not, we will say, we can't believe we got people to admit to thinking, to answering in a always, like in a superlative way. So, for example, we have a statement that says, I act before I think. Culturally speaking, that's not a particularly acceptable way to communicate the justification for how you would act. We typically would say, I always try to think before I act, because there's a kind of cultural association that people who act before they think might be reckless. And yet, this example of willingness absolutely creates compelling data that allows us to differentiate from different kinds of listeners. And these kind of examples abound in our assessment. What else have we learned? Here's part 2. We have needed to revise our theory of listening in response to what the data is telling us. So for example, we initially began our new theory of listening with 9 capacities and revised the assessment to include 10 because the data that we were collecting on presence in particular was not cleaving enough to tell us something specific about that type of listener profile. And so we eventually revised our theory to include willingness, because what we were seeing was that there wasn't in our assessment, there wasn't a conversion point toward action that we needed to measure in order to understand how particular listeners behaved once they had listened to a different perspective. Number 2, we've needed to revise our assessment in response to what the data is telling us, which pushed us to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the research behind each capacity. And the example that I'll talk about here for a moment is curiosity. We ran our initial beta test and had a number of statements associated with curiosity, and when the data returned back to us, it was very obvious to us that people were struggling. There wasn't enough compelling data to indicate that people listened to curiosity in a compelling way when compared to the other capacities. And so what we did was we went back into psychological research and a number of different areas of research on curiosity to see, well, are we missing aspects of curiosity in our statements that people might identify with that would suggest that we have a fuller understanding of how curious listeners actually work? And in the process of doing so, I think we had initially about 20 questions, only about 2 or 3 were returning really good data. So then we wrote 20 or 30 more and then ran a beta test again, and all of a sudden, we were getting the same kind of data spread that was characteristic of the other capacities, and we felt that we could behaviorally pinpoint the capacities of a curious listener. So that has been the kind of recursive process between the data we've collected, the research, and then informing how we collect data and analyze the data has been a really helpful process for the development of the assessment. Number 3, we've needed to set more traps in the assessment in order to increase its accuracy. Now, I want you to don't hear me say we're setting traps as to say you're not listening, so much as what we're trying to do is triangulate whether or not repeated superlative answers are actually consistent with the behavioral tendencies of presence. So we ask a number of questions that on the surface will seem consistent with someone who is exhibiting presence or curiosity or association, but in fact there's a kind of a turn to it that would indicate, if you're not paying very careful attention to it, you're like, oh, that's definitely me. It signifies the opposite of what we're trying to measure. Those questions are extremely important for developing correlation analysis, because what it will show, as I'll show in a moment, is that how we perceive ourselves as listeners is not necessarily how we come across to others as listeners. And I'll give a concrete example of that. Okay, some of the most powerful insights we have drawn come from correlation analysis. So let me share this example with you. Okay. So here we have 3 statements. I'm going to just read the analysis here for you rather than kind of ad-lib it. So we have 3 statements here. So we present the statement, I avoid topics that cause disagreement to measure a person's relationship to willingness. According to our existing data set, someone who answers this question with a strong yes, no, or somewhere in between is highly likely, to the tune of it's a really strong correlation, to answer the same way when presented with the statement, I practice what I will say in a meeting before the meeting occurs, which is a measurement of presence. So, if a person says never to the first statement, they will highly likely say never to the second as well. Conversely, if a person says always to the first statement, they will probably always say always to the second statement as well. So let's consider the positive implications of this correlation. If I practice what I say before a meeting, and in doing so I'm trying to exhibit presence, it may be because I want to avoid topics that cause disagreement, which is a measurement of willingness. Cool, that seems reasonable. Now, if we analyze that insight by placing it alongside other correlations with different listening capacities, a fuller motivational scene emerges. For example, someone who answers these previous 2 statements positively, I avoid topics and I practice what I will say, is also highly likely to give a positive answer to the statement, contextual factors are valid excuses for people's behaviors, which is a measurement of curiosity. One way to read this correlation is that a person will look for contextual factors to explain a person's behaviors so that they may feel more prepared in a meeting and thereby avoid conflict. Again, that sounds totally reasonable. But another way to read it is that a person may graft motivations onto a person's behaviors based on their perception of key contextual factors in order to avoid disagreement and control a listening situation. This deduction becomes especially interesting given that the aforementioned three statements correlate highly to the statement, "I am easily distracted when analyzing details," which is a statement that measures focus. That's a trap question, by the way. The upshot is that a person who practices what they will say to avoid conflict may struggle to identify new or different details within a listening scene if conflict emerges. They may simply dissociate when conflict arises or discount the tension as symptomatic of a toxic listening environment. Convincing them that this is a possibility could be challenging, however, because they consciously identify contextual factors that explain or excuse a person's behavior. Taken together, these behaviors may come across to an audience as controlling, tone-deaf, ungenerous, and/or rigid, which is a problem because that person may imagine themselves as prepared, sensitive to context, committed to collegiality, and understanding of contextual factors that produce what they feel are unproductive exchanges. Cool, right? Okay, what we've learned so far, part 3. So again, what this example shows is that correlation analysis shows that how we perceive ourselves as listeners may come into conflict with how others see us as listeners. And one of the advantages of having an assessment is that it's self-directed. So if a person is answering honestly and we say, look, here are all of the ways that you have strengths and this is how you probably are successful in any listening situation, but we're kind of a neutral party that mediates a number of different situations. Based on our data, it's also possible that you could be coming across this way. Have you ever experienced situations like that? At which point that creates the space for professional development, which is really actually quite exciting because it functions as leadership training, or teacher training, or managerial training, or any kind of human communication training. Number 2, correlation analysis shows that we can create different scales of our assessment. So when we start, do you remember when at the beginning I said some questions we weight differently because they cleave and they tell us more about a listener than some other statements do? Our ability to run correlation analysis shows us that we can develop a pretty accurate picture of how a person listens in about 15 to 20 questions. If we wanted to develop a capacity-specific assessment, let's say we want to assess Julia's ability to be an associational listener, we could actually break down the assessment that way and on a behavioral level say, here are the ways that you lean in as an associational listener and here's how it manifests in your life, and here are the things that you may not do as fully as an associational listener. I had an experience with this, and this was kind of the aha moment for Chris and I. I had a friend of mine took the assessment and encouraged his wife to do the same. And I had never met the wife before, and I flew across the country to go have lunch with them and to talk about the assessment. And before I gave the assessment, I gave a public lecture about the college admissions essay, and their son had attended, and she attended as well. Now, when I was analyzing her data, the prediction of my friend turned out to be true. He said, look, my wife is a psychologist. She studies these things. She implements them for a living. Her data is going to be muddled. And I said, perfect. That's going to be a really good test case. And true enough, it was extremely muddled. One of the listening capacities rose to the top, though. She was a stronger associational listener. And so I started to dig into the data. And what I realized was that her associational score would have jumped out more if she had exhibited one behavioral characteristic a little bit more strongly that we call implicational breadth, which is the ability to become convinced by a connection once you've made it. And so you cannot make this stuff up. I gave the talk, And she and her son came down, and her son introduced me and says, "Hi, I'm Taylor. It's really nice to meet you," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, "Oh, it's nice to meet you too." And then she introduced herself and said, "I took your assessment." I said, "I'm so looking forward to having lunch with you. Your data was so interesting. I'd love to hear your perspective." And she goes, "About that. I want to talk to you about that." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "When I was taking your assessment, I started to make connections across the different questions, and I noticed some smart affinities between each of the questions. I'm just not convinced it has anything to tell me." And so this is a person who I had never met before, and our assessment predicted that was how she would orient as a listener, and she quite literally, as a first step of communication, performed that behavioral trait upon meeting me. I think I gasped a little bit, which threw her off a little bit, and then I immediately called Chris, like, "You're not going to believe what just happened." So it's a really, we felt like we were building something really credible in that moment, because all of a sudden we were able to almost pinpoint behavioral tendencies that would manifest even if the person who's filling out the assessment might not be consciously aware of it. Okay, we can do multi-capacity, which is the one we're doing. You can say, how are we measuring assessment, focus, and perseverance? How do they relate to a person in their professional and personal life? Or we can do a full assessment that measures all 10 capacities. So that's really neat, and we'll make these available to the public at various levels when we finish the algorithm and patent it. When we share our provisional findings to non-academic audiences, they intuitively understand the potential benefits of our assessment. For example, one time I have 3 little girls, and they were taking a swim lesson. I happened to be sitting with a resident oncologist at the Mayo Clinic, and we were talking about our various research approaches. And she asked me what I did, and I said, "Well, I'm studying listening." I'm like, "I'm going to try out the listening assessment pitch here." And so I started to tell her about what we were doing, and she said, "Hold on a second." I said, "I want to tell you how incredibly valuable this is." And I said, "Well, explain to me why." And she said, "So many of my patients refuse care because they believe at a fundamental level that their doctors are not listening to them. And the real difficulty that we have is we don't have the training to tailor our messages so that our patients can hear it. So if we had the ability to know how our individual patients were listening to us, we could actually provide higher quality care and present our perspectives in a way that was more probably going to be heard by them." And I thought, oh boy, that has a really powerful impact. When we talk about the power of listening, as someone, my mother went through oncological care and had that same kind of experience. I wonder how her care would have changed if we had a listening assessment mediating the process. And then I have all sorts of cool examples associated with AI, but I don't want to geek out on you too much. And then the last thing, through these conversations, we've begun to imagine a range of exciting applications for our assessment. Some of those assessments involve how do we create more productive working relationships among colleagues. Some of these applications involve when you're trying to hire somebody, and you have let's say you had a really exceptional department chair who cycled out of the position, and you wanted to ensure the continued success of the department, you could run a listening assessment and say, this is the type of listener that has been successful in this context, and you could measure whether or not other prospective candidates fit that similar profile. Again, the point is not to profile people, it's to say, how can we use analytics and data and listening data to put our colleagues in the best position possible in order to succeed? What if a group had a significant operational success completing tasks over and over again? What if we could learn about the different types of listening strategies that they employed, and then see if we could replicate that dynamic in other kinds of situations to increase the probability of success in other situations? The bottom line is that when we learn about how people listen and we assume that they have the capacity to grow or get better at it, and we can measure it with accuracy, we can actually use that data in really compelling ways to help them be more successful moving forward in the future. So what's next? We got to complete our correlation analysis, which is a massive undertaking. given how many sample questions we have. We're going to finalize our algorithm that automates the assessment process. So that's the big hurdle that we have to cross. When we've collected and validated the data, we want to have an algorithm that actually processes and allows us to watch whether or not we're actively assessing our subjects accurately. We're going to file for patent and trademark, which is a weird thing to say as humanists, but that's the next step. We'll release the assessment to the public, continue to analyze the data as the audience scales. We'll refine and or revise questions based on the scaling of our operation. We'll develop professional training and curriculum to support listening capacity development, and then we're going to finish and publish our book. Probably the first thing that will happen is we'll finish and publish our book, and then all the other things will happen as well. So thank you so much for being generous listeners about our assessment. We'd be very happy to answer questions that you might have about our assessment or about our research and where it's moving forward. Go ahead. Yes.
I was curious, could you go ahead and geek out on the AI example?
Sure. The way that large language models work, they shouldn't be called large language models. They should be called massively, incomprehensibly large language models. The kind of parameters that they use to create reliable output are near the 200 billion range. And the neural networks that create those parameters to put words in sequence do so without a lot of human intervention. So they're so powerful that they just start making connections and seeing patterns. As I explain to people who ask me about AI, like, why is it that like ChatGPT's output feels so generic? The way that I explain it to them is, well, it's kind of like Costco. Like, if you really want a good hot dog, you could go to Costco and you could get a hot dog, but the size and the scale of the operation all but ensures that you're going to get a pretty generic thing, because that's how they have to produce in order to operate on a broader scale. They have to be doing a lot of different things at once. Whereas if you went to downtown Chicago, you went to like a boutique hot dog store, or hot dog restaurant, they might say, well, we're going to put these things together because we have the time to curate the ingredients. We have the ability to put things together that are surprising or innovative, and you're like, that's really cool too. And so when I talk with AI engineers, they have expressed a lot of frustration that they don't know how to move forward with non-generic output. And however useful the output may be at the current moment, they know it has a shelf life. It has to keep getting better. Well, one of the ways that it can get better is if the large language models have the ability to see something about audience that includes more than kind of crude demographic information. So if we can teach the large language model to listen, or to at least identify the characteristic traits of a listener's preferences, they can do what that resident oncologist wanted to do with her patients, which is, I want to be able to tailor content in a very specific way so that the audience can hear it. So like my daughters, for example, will use generative AI and they'll say, tell me more about the second law of thermodynamics, and they'll get a really technical explanation. Because the LLM doesn't know who the audience is. They don't know how to tailor it to them. So then they have to reprompt it and they have to say, well, now explain it as if it were to a 12-year-old. And then they might get something like that, but, and as anybody who's spent any time with children knows, like, I have twins, they've had uniform experiences their whole life, and that they couldn't have more different personalities, and they learn very, very differently. So you can start to see glimmers of that. If we can use our algorithm to create occasions to train large language models to create more personalized output that doesn't require it crawling our personal archives, that doesn't create these kind of crude stereotypes based on demographic data, it could actually create more useful applications that help people in more precise ways. Did I geek out accurately? Okay, good. You had a question.
Yes.
What is you guys' plan for implementing this, like, into society? Like, where are you going to use it? Who's going to be taking the test?
You want to take the test?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question, and I think it kind of remains to be seen. One of the really exciting things when we talk to non-academics about our listening assessment is, as I said, they intuitively understand the value of its application. I've got a good friend who, she works for a consulting company, works with like Fortune 10 companies in order to improve their operations and integrate technology in really sophisticated ways. I was telling her about my assessment and she goes, "Will you please let me know when that's available?" And that's really exciting because you talk about integrating listening into Fortune 10 companies, that could have a really massive impact on how the public begins to listen.
What if we gave it to all the ASU students first year coming in, right? And then also seniors, leave them free of charge, let them do it so that because the thing about the survey is it's not an objective truth, that's carved in stone for all time. You take it as a freshman, you'll get certain results and it'll change, And as you get older, it will change too, probably. But I think it could have valuable educational impact, for students and teachers to understand problems in the classroom or better ways to create an argument or actually do real audience analysis and not just assume the audience is some sort of fake version of myself when you say write to an audience.
One of the things that when I talk to educators about our assessment, we say, what if you had one of the hardest things about being a teacher and preparing as a teacher for a class is you don't know who your students are when you're developing the course. But if you had a kind of listening assessment in place and you're taking roll and it says Chris is leans toward focus, association, and generosity. Julia leans towards suspension, curiosity, and willingness. All of those things, if we started to teach based on the individualized ways that our students listen, the probability of retention would theoretically increase. I don't know if that makes sense. And just minimally, like, the very act of paying attention to how people listen changes the way that you communicate with them. Yeah. And I'll give you the rough and tumble example. Do you want to?
No, go ahead.
I mentioned earlier that I'm a focused listener. I'm married to an associational listener. And
that's just why I teased him and laughed.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And I tell this story because I think it's a really nice moment of how no matter how much you train at listening and argument, you still fall into the same pitfalls. It's just how do you negotiate the problem and create resolution and understanding more easily. So my wife and I have been married for 20 years. Our arguments oftentimes follow a pretty predictable trajectory, as most people, friends, couples, whatever do. I might say something like, I want to talk to you about this particular issue that frustrated me. And because she's an associational listener, what she'll say is, oh, you want to talk about that? Well, if you want to talk about that, we got to talk about this, and this. If I'm frustrated about the thing that I want to talk about, I will hear that as deflection. I will say, why don't you ever want to address the issue? Like, in order for us to achieve resolution, we need to actually talk about the issue that is bothering me or the issue that's bothering you. What she hears when I say we need to talk about this focused issue is you can't get out of the weeds and see the broader picture of how this particular situation is actually symptomatic of, arguments that we've had or behaviors that we've observed in one another before that point. And so since we...
Or are part of cultural scripts in a system that you're functioning within, whether it's how you perform as a professional at work or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so since developing this assessment, what I've started to do is listen for those opportunities to say, maybe that thing that I'm accusing her of being deflecting is actually a way that she's trying to hear me. Rather than thinking about listening as a light switch, like you turn it on and we all sit forward and we look at each other in the eye and we smile and nod and repeat back. We can perform all of these nonverbal traits and still have conflict. So if that's true, then we need more complicated frameworks for negotiating conflict in our life. And one of the ways that we can do that is to listen for how the people with whom we're interacting are hearing or listening to what we're saying. If you can do that even on a nominal level, Like as a teacher, if you are trying to hear how your students are listening, that will by definition make you a more careful, nuanced teacher, because you will be presenting things in a way that's specific to Cedric and Jake and Julia and Curtis. Does that make sense? And students will by definition feel like they are being heard and might be willing to take additional risks in the class that they would not otherwise had they not felt like they were being seen for who they are.
And I think moving to the sort of types of listening that's going on, I come from a family that is very conservative, religious, in ways that I'm not. And so when we talk about things, there's like a big divide, and we've kind of agreed to not talk about certain things, right? And that can buy you relationships, but that's not always possible either. So having these categories of how people listen kind of helps you step back a little bit and not get so focused on the you're right, you're wrong, you're right, you're wrong kind of thing, but understand how people are operating. And that honestly was my original interest in all of this.
There's a question from the online.
Okay.
Yeah.
Richard Borowitz, are you taking into account any behavioral health issues participants may have, such as ADHD, when reviewing results?
Not yet. We have deliberately avoided taking any kind of personal data, and we're just trying to measure if and to what degree the statements that we measure produce a diverse enough quantitative spread that it signifies that it accounts for different kinds of listening tendencies. Eventually, we will move into a space where we collect demographic data and then analyze accordingly, but at this stage in our beta analysis, we are not there. It's not that we haven't thought about it, it's just that it's not the right time to introduce those kind of variables. Yeah.
Cedric?
I'm thinking about this somewhat similar with listening and how like body language plays a part in it, because like when I'm in a classroom and I hear students, I'm listening, but then I might have my head bowed, I want to quote it because I want to really take it in, but then somebody will read it as disinterest or boredom or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like how, negotiate the different types of body language, or even sometimes with the settings. So like if I'm on the phone, I'm listening, but then I sometimes process it, so it may go silent for a minute or two. And they're like, are you still there? Like, I'm there. You're just still listening or taking it in. So with all those things, how would those play a factor in it with listening?
Yeah, absolutely, especially the silences, because a lot of my work has been dealt with listening to the sort of unstated assumptions. And so those are sort of not being voiced, but they're haunting as we speak, so there's that. But there's also the sort of contemplative moments that you're talking about, where the silence indicates, I'm trying to process this, I'm trying to take this in. And yeah, that's very much been a part of what I've been talking about. Body language, we haven't focused on so much, although it's really important. A lot of the listening out there, research does what Kyle says, look at the person in the eye, nod your head, repeat back, and so that there's this kind of bodily engagement so that we see what's going on. But that's not necessarily the same thing as my saying, I'm offering you a generous interpretation. I might be doing that and performing that and thinking, you're ridiculous. I mean, not that I would think that of you, Cedric, but you know what I'm saying? Right. So what we're trying to do is go deeper in terms of how, when I talked about rhetorical listening in terms of capacities, what are the capacities? And if we know what some of them are, then we can recognize them in ourselves. Maybe we can recognize them in others, or at least it's a place to start a conversation. Yeah.
One of the ways that we get around that in practical terms with our statements is we run statements alongside of one another, one that is based on self-perception, and then one that is based on feedback that another person has observed. So we might say, I actively, or I avoid conflict in meetings, let's say, versus people say that I avoid conflict in meetings. This is where the correlation analysis becomes really powerful, because if you measure those two things against, let's say, I act before I think, if we have a number of data points that say, for example, people are observing and you're aware of what people are observing about you, and then you say, I act before I think, and you say, rarely or never, I rarely ever do that, then we can say, well, people might be thinking this about you, but in fact, you perceive yourself as listening, and then we can correlate that data to then build a fuller motivational picture. So part of the challenge that we're facing right now is that so many of our questions are highly relevant, but no one wants to take, a 150 question assessment. They want to take a 10 question assessment or a 20 question assessment.
Yeah.
And so we're sacrificing some of that nuance, but we're trying to bake it into the algorithm so that if you, for example, said, well, but what if I fold my hands and I dip my head so I can focus more intent? That actually, I think, would be a posture of focus, if you're asking me. Personally, it would also show up in other kinds of behavioral functions within focus as an area of study. And then we can, again, correlate that with other kind of self and audience perceptions.
And to follow on that, we've thought about coming up with different iterations of the survey so that we could have something online that anybody could take anytime they wanted to click onto it, 10 questions, 15 questions, something like that. Boom, you get kind of an idea. And then also maybe have the 200 question survey if, organizations are interested in that, going deeper to see what's happening. So
you can imagine a scenario where a very high stakes position might want to have a more elaborate assessment, especially if they've developed a kind of profile of the kind of leader that's successful, that tends to thrive. We say this all the time at ASU, that this institution is very unique, and the pace, the speed of our operations, the scope of our operations has a tendency to kind of say, well, you deal with it and you succeed, or you can't lead within this kind of space. That doesn't mean you're not a leader in any other situation, but it might mean that, for whatever reason at this time, the way that the university is moving, it might not be the best situation for you. So you can imagine if, let's say you're trying to hire a provost or a new president or any other kind of, leader in between, that could give you a really full sense of what do our colleagues say that they need from our leader in this situation, and do their desires match the capacities or the tendencies of this leader? It's really hard we do a lot of rigorous assessment of colleagues before they arrive on campus, but it still doesn't always, it's not a reliable predictor about what happens when they're actually in the live show and having to do the work.
Yeah, there's one question from the online attendee, Lauren Johnson. Can you share more insight about the benefits of self-analysis assessment versus maybe an assessment with scenarios, proctor interview style, and then analyzing responses?
I'm sorry, what was the last part again?
The last part, can you, I'll read it.
Okay.
Can you share more insight about the benefits of self-analysis assessment versus maybe an assessment with scenarios, proctor interview style, and then analyzing responses?
Yeah. So like Deborah Tannen's research, when she studied listening, she went in and did ethnographic research. She sat in business meetings and that kind of thing. She sat in classrooms, and she observed and then wrote up her theory of listening. And I think that gave us valuable information. She did some of this in the 90s and the 2000s, and she still has a piece where she found that women will nod their heads like this as somebody else is talking, and men tend to read that, not all men, but a general enough pattern. Men will read that as I agree, and then at the end when he's done, the woman will go, no, I don't really want to do that. And he's like, well, you were like, and conversely, Men will oftentimes interrupt women, and women are like, you're not allowing me to have my voice. But men jockey back and forth with each other all the time. That's a sign of respect. So it's where you position yourself to how you hear those things. She gathered that information from being the sort of ethnographic observer who proctored different situations and came up with things. I think that's an absolutely valid way of doing things. We're just doing it a slightly different way. And we're not saying this is some sort of objective truth that we're coming out. We're capturing a snapshot of a moment when you took that survey. But I think it can be useful because I think especially the associational focus kind of back and forth, suddenly if you see that, if you have language for that, then you know how to negotiate a little bit better, and you're not making assumptions, those unstated assumptions that are haunting us. You're not making assumptions that the other person's wrong or out to get me or whatever. It's like, oh, there's a different kind of structure of thinking going on here, and so how do I engage that? And it becomes, just by doing that, just by that very fact, you become more generous, right?
I agree. Another helpful way to think about it is the scalability of the assessment itself. So the secondary title of the book that we're writing is From the Kitchen Table to the Workplace. If you're doing, that kind of like ethnographic work, let's say in a workplace, it might not like the person that I am at ASU might be slightly different than the type of person that I am at home when I'm listening to my wife or my daughters or my dad or my friends. It might be different than if I'm in other kinds of situations. And so the challenge in that approach, and I think this is why this is such a good question, is, well, are our self-perceptions necessarily reflective of how we actually
are received
in the world? And that's why we run correlation analysis and why we ask questions to triangulate the data. As again, the trope of trap is not exactly correct. It's just kind of a shorthand to say, are we measuring one's self-perception, or are we actually getting into the granular detail of how people listen in real time? And so we build in various feedback loops to ensure, to the extent that we're capable of developing a really dimensional picture of how people listen. But that's I guess what I would say is, I don't think you have to choose. This is a method, and I think if you put both methods together, and probably 3 or more, you would find even more richness. And to me, at least, and I know, Chris, this would be true for you, like that would be a really exciting moment, because it would indicate that listening is getting the full attention of our research insights. So, yeah, it's a really thoughtful question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, if there are no more questions, we hope you'll hang around and chat.
Sure.
Eat a little bit of food, and can we thank our panelists?
Thank you all for coming.